I've just watched a bunch of people do My Life in the Theater for Playbill, and I thought that would be a fun thing to do. I don't have the playbills, but I've got all my shows right in front of me here on the opposite wall, so I'm just going to go down the list. The very first one, 1970, No No Nanette. Um, I got that show while I was out of town doing summer stock. I never auditioned for it. Buster Davis, the truly insane musical director, found out I was at Casa Manana, got the number of the green room phone, called me out of the blue, and offered me No No Nanette. That's, that's as unlikely a way to make your Broadway debut as possible. I was very thrilled when I got to New York and found out there actually wasn't a contract and it wasn't just a come on. While I was performing it, I had an audition for Leonard Bernstein for a new show that he was writing. I was in the chorus of No No Nanette. I had no credits. There's no reason why Leonard Bernstein should have taken me seriously, but he did, and he cast me in his Mass to open the John F. Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. When I arrived down there, I went up to the top of the newly constructed John F. Kennedy Center, stood on the outdoor terrace, and looked out over all the monuments in Washington, D.C., and I thought, is this really my life now? Yes, it was. We recorded that show for Columbia Records with Bernstein. Took it to the Philadelphia Academy of Music and finally to the Metropolitan Opera, where we played for 16 weeks. And I had a dressing room on the stage level, right behind the stage, with a chaise lounge. And it was absolutely beyond belief. And I got to work with Leonard Bernstein and sing at the Metropolitan Opera. Just crazy. Shortly after this, I got hired to do the Student Prince National Tour, which was to be on the road for a year and then come back to the Winter Garden Theater. That's where I got to meet George Rose. I was playing Detlef, the leader of the students, but he was playing the character part of Lutz, and I found myself so intoxicated by his electric comic performance that I would be standing in the wings during half the shows. I got to know him and hang out in his dressing room and find out the whole history of this theater business that I was now in. I did the national tour of Very Good Eddie, playing Monsieur de Rougemont with a little painted on the mustache. And in that show, believe it or not, I was the lead dancer. My partner was Candy Darling, not the drag queen, the beautiful, beautiful chorus girl who at the time we were touring was dating Meatloaf. I did the splits twice in that number as the lead dancer in a touring Broadway show. Simply unbelievable. I came back to New York and got hired for a little tiny show called King of Schnorrers. I thought that was the worst title I'd ever heard, but it was based on a very famous short story by Israel Zangwill. And we moved into the Harold Clurman Theater. When I say we moved in, up until the week we opened the Harold Clurman Theater, it was a whorehouse. Like they moved the whores out, repainted, and moved us in. Here we are in this little tiny show. We opened on an off news day, and all the major critics came. And the New York Times loved the show. So the next thing you knew, you couldn't get a ticket to King of Schnorrers at the Harold Clurman Theater. So our producer picked us up and moved us lock, stock, and barrel, just as we were, into the 48th Street Playhouse. So now we're this little tiny show on this great big stage. We opened to the New York critics and they killed us. So that was the end of King and Schnorr's. I did get to do an amazing number by Grover Dale, by the fop Belasco, who was in love with his clothes. So Grover staged this amazing number where I danced with my clothes and sang "I Have Not Lived in Vain." It was a brilliant number, and I was very thrilled to get to do that. Then I had an audition for Cardinal Richelieu and the Three Musketeers. My only character background was having played Monsieur de Rougemont on the road and the fop Belasco in King of Schnorr's. So when I went in for Cardinal Richelieu for Tom O'Horigan, it was really a stretch. He said to me at the first audition, "Will you come back next week with something evil?" So of course it's very hard to find an evil song in the traditional Broadway rep. So I wrote a song called "A Villain's Work Is Never Done" that went from a low G to a high C. I didn't know it was possible to write your own song for an audition, but I went in and I sang that for Tom O'Horigan and he cast me. And that's how I ended up in the amazing Broadway revival of The Three Musketeers and wearing those amazing costumes by Freddie Whitop. They were truly, truly out of this world. What an honor to do that. And I had a dressing room right off stage right on stage level. Absolutely incredible. And we were thrown out of that theater in a week. My flowers weren't even dead yet. Then I had the amazing stroke of luck to get cast in Pippin, the final national tour starring Ben Vereen. And he was set to direct it as well, as he'd done it many times and he was never going to do it again. So he agreed to be the lead player in the final national tour of Pippin. I was only about 35 years old at the time, and I could not believe that I got cast as Charlemagne in that amazing company. But I got to play Charlemagne opposite Ben Vereen, a once-in-a-lifetime event. By the way, as soon as I got back from that, Janet Hayes Walker at the York Theatre had agreed to do my composition, Shylock, based on The Merchant of Venice, something that was suggested to me by the fight director from the Royal Shakespeare Company when I was doing The Three Musketeers. I showed my draft of it to Janet. She agreed to do it. We shook hands. There was no contract. I left town to do Pippin, and sure enough, when I got back, we went into rehearsals for Shylock, which got me my first Dramadesk nomination. I received a nomination for Best Actor in a Musical opposite Mandy Patinkin, Colm Wilkinson, and Robert Lindsay. I thought I was being punked when they called to tell me that had happened. And crazily enough, I had just been nominated opposite Colm Wilkinson, and I joined the company of Les Miserables, only 1 year old, at the Broadway Theatre. At my audition, I was auditioning for Jean Valjean, and in the middle of it, they said, "Do you have something funny?" And I thought, well, that's the end of my Jean Valjean number. So the audition was on stage at the Broadway Theatre. They asked me to sing Master of the House. I said, I don't know it. So they said, well, go down into the pit and read it with the accompanist. So I walked down into the pit of the Broadway Theatre, And there is my old friend playing the piano. I put my arm around her, we swayed back and forth, and I was reading Master of the House over her shoulder, opposite Sandy Campbell, my old friend. And I hear from the back of the house, "So will you do it?" I looked back and I said, "Don't you think you should call my agent?" And they said, "Oh, we will." And they did. And a week later, I was in rehearsal for the Master of the House at the Broadway Theater, the biggest hit on Broadway. They threw me on so quickly. My first night in the show, I was thinking, the ushers out there know Master of the House better than I do. But I certainly got to know Master of the House as I did it 1,700 times. Life is really stranger than fiction. When I finally left the Three Musketeers, Les Miserables, I had an audition for Cyrano, the musical, which was a big hit in London and was being brought over by the very wealthy producer Joop van den Ende, who produced this gigantic version of Cyrano. I was fortunate enough to be playing another Master of the House, the baker, Ragueneau the baker in Cyrano. This show was so gigantic that when my big baking number happened, the stage opened and up from the basement came the entire bakery, completely formed. And down from the second level ceiling came this gigantic staircase. I appeared at the top of it in the largest chef's hat that any human being had ever worn. I was exactly like Hello Dolly coming back to all her friends at the Harmonia Gardens. Has anybody ever had such an entrance? What an unbelievable stroke of luck. Unfortunately, the show was not greatly beloved by the critics, and although Joop van den Ende could keep the show running for something like 6 months, eventually we were tossed out. But I got to have that truly amazing experience. Sometime around this time, I had my first audition for Sunset Boulevard. When I first heard the song The Greatest Star of All from the London Company, I thought that it was 3 different people singing the song because the original Max sounded one way in his upper register, a different way in his middle register, and a different way in his lower register. When I found out that song was for one person, I realized I had the capacity to do something special with that song. So I started working on it, knowing that it would be coming to New York eventually. And by the time I had my audition for the first national, I had sung that song every single day for a year, complete with my own staging. So when I was finally called in for the first national tour, I walked into that rehearsal room, and all of that rehearsal came into the room with me. I've never had an experience like it. Later on, the production stage manager told me, an actor comes into the room and tells you what to do, and you told us you were going to be Max. That is indeed what happened. I got nominated for the Joseph Jefferson Award on the road. But then I heard that the Signature Theater was doing it a couple of years later in Washington, D.C., and my old friend Eric Schaefer was directing it. So I called him up and I said, "Eric, don't hold auditions for Max because I'm doing it." You've got to be pretty good friends with somebody to pull that off. But apparently I did, because I did end up playing Max at the Signature Theater opposite my dear friend Flo Lacey. I'd gotten to do it on the road opposite my dear, dear friend Linda Balgord, who's now no longer with us. God bless her. But I got to do a completely different version at the Signature Theater. I got nominated for and won the Helen Hayes Award for Max in Sunset Boulevard. God bless Eric Schaefer and the Signature Theater. That brings me up to the Scarlet Pimpernel. Something happened on this that had never happened before. I just finished doing Max on the road, and I was very full of vim and vigor. And I auditioned for two parts, two small parts that I thought if they were put together would make a nice turn for me. But they told me that somebody had already been promised one of the parts, so they offered me this tiny little part. And because I wanted to be a part of the Scarlet Pimpernel on Broadway, I said yes for a lot of money, even though it was just this little tiny part. The contract was all finished and at my agent's office, and they called and said, would he consider doing Ozzie instead? Now, I'd been studying the script, so of course I knew that Ozzie was a much larger part than the part I'd already agreed to. So I said yes to a part that I had never auditioned for. I just don't know if that's ever happened before in the history of Broadway. And when I got into the room, I found out it was starring the amazing Douglas Sills. Holy crap, who was so amazing. And I got to do that show with him for a year. And I got to do our big number, Into the Fire, at Radio City Music Hall for the Tonys. And part of my performance is preserved there for all time in that video. Thank God. Let me look around the corner here. Oh my God. This brings me up to Iceman Cometh. One of the biggest casting directors in New York saw the Scarlet Pimpernel with my agent, and he leaned over to him and said, I'm going to get something good for Ed. You just watch me. Well, the thing that he got me was the hottest ticket in town, Iceman Cometh, starring Kevin Spacey, with every character actor in the known world in it. And our wonderful, wonderful producer, Manny Eisenberg, we were doing a limited run. And on stage, he promised us all that if we would all agree to do this for scale, if we made a profit at the end, he would split it with us. We did make a profit, and Manny Eisenberg was good for his word, and he split it with us. I don't believe anything like that has ever happened in the history of Broadway. Just amazing. Oh my God. And then, after having done the impossible for an actor with all of my musicals to get to do a straight play on Broadway, that's already impossible. But then my dear friend Ethan McSweeney asked me to do The Best Man on Broadway. So I follow up a straight play with a straight play on Broadway with an all-star cast. And they absolutely insisted that I stand by for Charles Durning, who was playing the lead role, the President of the United States. I did not want to play Senator Carlin while standing by for Charles Durning, but that was the deal. When we started rehearsal, Charles was in the hospital, so he was very late to rehearsal. So in the beginning part of rehearsals, I got to play Senator Carlin and the President of the United States at every rehearsal. So we opened with very little rehearsal for Charles, and after we'd only played one performance, Charles missed a plane flight out of town, and when I got to the theater to sign in, I was told, "Ed, you're on." They had no costumes for me. I had to send somebody to my house to get my own tuxedo because the president appeared in a tuxedo. And I went on for the lead role in a straight play on Broadway and took the final bow. I'll just never get over that. One of the miracles of my career. Somehow I managed to skip the national tour of the best little whorehouse in Texas with Ann-Margret. When I heard that was happening, I said to myself, I'm either going to get that or I'm going to die trying. So I wrote a song called Big Black Gun to audition for the governor of Texas. And I went in and I did that song, and I did a split at the end of that song. And I did indeed get hired to play the governor of Texas with Miss Ann-Margret. And I toured with her for a year and a half. And whatever expectations one might have of a big star going on a tour, Ann-Margret went far beyond all those possible expectations. She was a dream with every single member of the company, with every crew member, with every fan, with everyone she came in contact with for a year and a half. Extraordinary to have had that time with Ann-Margret. Now let me get to Sunday in the Park with George. I'd had a very unsuccessful audition with Mr. Sondheim for Passion, and he cut me off in the middle of my song because I tried to do a piece of unknown material for him. So when I went in for Sunday in the Park, I thought I need to do something well known, and it's got to be something Southern because Mr. who I was auditioning for is Southern. So I wanted to sing It's Gonna Be Another Hot Day from 110 in the Shade, something I'd loved all my life, but I didn't have the music for it. So I wrote an arrangement of Gonna Be Another Hot Day and went into the 42nd Street studios to audition for Mr. Sondheim. It was a small room, and he was sitting right there as I sang, "Well, it's gonna be another hot day. Yes, it's gonna be another hot day." And when I got to the end of it, he said, "That's it." I went home and called my agent and said, "I think I may have just gotten that show." And indeed I did. I got to rehearse with Stephen Sondheim. I got invited to a party at his house. I got to open the first revival of Sunday in the Park with George, with Mr. Sondheim right there in the audience. And I got to tell Mr. Sondheim that I'd worked with his old friend Burt Shevelov. And when I told him that, he asked me how I'd liked Burt. And I said, well, for the opening night of No No Nanette, I was 20 and he was 60, and he grabbed me on the staircase and kissed me. And Sondheim said, "Where's your staircase?" Okay, so now we're up to the best little horror. I'm sorry. We're up to How the Grinch Stole Christmas. It had already played one season, so I knew what was coming. When I went in to audition for it, I wanted them to hire me to play the old dog Max. And I was about 60-something at the time, and I did not want to have to go through a dance audition. So I wrote a little song called You Can't Teach an Old Dog New Tricks. And I wrote it in the form of a soft shoe, and I did a soft shoe while I sang, "Well, you can't teach an old dog new tricks," and they hired me for that show. We negotiated a contract thinking, how much would I have to get to do 12 shows a week and not hate myself? So my agent and I negotiated for the largest contract I'd ever had, and was very satisfied when we got it. But after the contract was already finished, we found out that we had been negotiating for 8 shows. So every show above 8, we got a penalty based on the largest contract I had ever negotiated. So it ended up being twice as much money as I'd ever thought about making on Broadway. A miracle of a miracle. There are a few more things. Oh, when I did Mary Poppins, that was a show I never auditioned for. And when I did Anything Goes, that was a show I never auditioned for. They were both right next to 42nd Street. And when I finished Mary Poppins, I was already rehearsing Anything Goes. So I went from one side of 42nd Street to the opposite in a different show and got to play the Stephen Sondheim Theater in Anything Goes. But I've been talking for a long time, so I'm going to cut now to Georgie. When I was about 68 years old, I realized that I'd been sitting on my George Rose stories for so long that it was all right for me to talk about them publicly, no matter how salacious they were. I wrote it in a frenzy. I started doing it in my living room for anyone who would listen. And eventually, the marvelous Perry Street Theatricals took it on, and we started doing backers auditions for everyone in the world. We got a theater and we lost it. We got another theater and we lost it. Finally, we got the Davenport Theater on West 45th Street, and I opened Georgie, My Adventures with George Rose, in the Davenport Theater in the heart of Broadway. I opened a show that I had written myself about my own life and my own history, and it was nominated for the Drama Desk Award, and it was nominated for the Outer Circle Critics Award, and I won the Drama Desk Award for Best Solo Performance, and that was 30 years to the day after I was nominated for Shylock. My life in the theater has been a miracle.